Get a job and stop being a leech, my daughter-in-law shouted in the middle of the family dinner. I burst out laughing. What she didn't know was that I was worth $5 million. So I simply replied, "Sweetheart, find yourself a new place to live. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Eileen, and for 3 years, I've been living a lie. Not the kind of lie you tell others, but the kind you tell yourself when you need to discover who people really are when they think you have nothing left to offer." The dinner invitation came on a Tuesday morning. Darren's voice sounded strained over the phone, the way it always did when Thalia was listening in the background. "Mom, would you like to come over for dinner Friday night? Thalia's making her famous lasagna." Famous! I almost laughed. The woman could barely boil water without burning it, but I'd learned to bite my tongue over the years. "That sounds lovely, sweetheart. What time?" 7:30, and Mom. He paused, and I could practically hear Thalia's sharp whisper in the background. "Maybe dress a little nicer this time? You know how Thalia likes things to look. Presentable, presentable." I stared at my reflection in the hallway mirror after hanging up, gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, no makeup, wearing the same faded cardigan I'd worn to their house a dozen times before. For 3 years, this had been my uniform. The grieving widow, struggling to make ends meet in her small apartment, dependent on her son's occasional generosity. Friday evening arrived with the kind of October chill that cuts right through you. I walked the 6 blocks to their house, the same route I'd taken countless times since Harold passed. The house looked exactly as it had when I'd bought it for them as a wedding gift 7 years ago. Not that they knew that, of course. Darren opened the door with that forced smile he'd perfected. "Hi, Mom. Come in, come in." He gave me a quick hug, the kind that felt obligatory rather than genuine. At 34, my son had grown into a man I barely recognized sometimes. Still handsome, still my boy, but there was something hollow in his eyes that hadn't been there before his marriage. "Eileen." Thalia's voice cut through the warm air like a blade. She appeared in the doorway to the dining room, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. At 29, she had the kind of aggressive beauty that demanded attention and respect, even when she'd done nothing to earn either. "Hello, Thalia. Thank you for having me." She looked me up and down with barely concealed disgust. Of course, family dinner and all that. The dining room was set with their best china, the kind reserved for guests who mattered. I noticed immediately that while Darren and Thalia had matching place settings, mine was different. Older plates, a mismatched glass, a fork with a slight bend in one of the tines. Small details that spoke volumes about how I was viewed in this house. "Mom, sit here." Darren gestured to the chair at the far end of the table, the one that put me furthest from both of them. I took my seat without comment, folding my hands in my lap as Thalia served the lasagna with theatrical flourishes. "I hope you like it," she said, though her tone suggested she couldn't care less whether I did or not. "It's an old family recipe, my grandmother's." I took a bite. It was mediocre at best, over-salted and undercooked in places. "It's delicious," I said anyway. The conversation limped along for the first 20 minutes. Darren talked about his job at the marketing firm, careful to avoid mentioning the promotion he'd been passed over for again. Thalia dominated most of the discussion, talking about her yoga classes, her shopping trips, her plans to redecorate the living room. "We're thinking of getting new furniture," she announced, cutting her lasagna into precise little squares. "Something more modern. The stuff we have now is so outdated." I remembered picking out that furniture with them when they'd first moved in. Thalia had loved it then, gushed about how perfect it was, but that was before she'd decided that everything in her life, including her husband's mother, needed an upgrade. "That sounds expensive," I said mildly. Thalia's eyes flashed. "Well, some people prioritize making their homes beautiful. Some people understand that you have to invest in quality." The barb was clear. I was neither beautiful nor quality, and certainly not worth investing in. I took another bite of the terrible lasagna and said nothing. "Actually, Mom," Darren began, and I could hear the reluctance in his voice. "We wanted to talk to you about something." I set down my fork and waited. Thalia leaned forward, her expression shifting into what she probably thought was concern. Eileen, we've been worried about you, living alone in that tiny apartment, struggling to make ends meet. It's been 3 years since Harold passed, and you're still not getting back on your feet. I'm managing fine, I said quietly. Are you, though? Thalia's voice took on that patronizing tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while delivering a blow. You can barely afford your rent. You shop at thrift stores. You don't even have a car anymore. All true, from their perspective. What they didn't know was that every choice had been deliberate. The small apartment was paid in cash. The thrift store clothes were a costume. The lack of a car was because I preferred to walk, not because I couldn't afford one. I get by, I said. Getting by isn't living, Mom, Darren said. And for a moment, I heard genuine concern in his voice. It gave me hope that somewhere underneath Thalia's influence, my real son still existed. But then Thalia took over again. The thing is, Eileen, we can't keep helping you forever. Darren works hard for his money, and we have our own future to think about. We want to start a family soon, and we need to be practical. I looked at my son, waiting for him to contradict her, to remind her that their help consisted of occasional dinners and birthday cards. He said nothing. Thalia continued, emboldened by his silence. What we're trying to say is, maybe it's time you thought about getting a job. You're only 64. Lots of people your age work. Walmart is always hiring greeters. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. Walmart greeter. After running a successful business for 20 years alongside Harold, after building the fortune that could buy and sell their entire neighborhood, she wanted me to stand at Walmart saying hello to strangers for minimum wage. A job, I repeated slowly. Yes. Thalia's eyes lit up like she'd just solved world hunger. Something to give you purpose, you know? Independence. Self-respect. Self-respect. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I've been thinking about your situation a lot lately, Thalia went on, clearly pleased with herself. And I realized what the problem is. You've gotten too comfortable being dependent on others. On Darren. It's not healthy for any of us. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger exactly. Something calmer and far more dangerous. Is that what you think I am? I asked. Dependent? Well, Thalia glanced at Darren, seeking backup. I mean, let's be honest here. You rely on us for everything. Every time there's a bill you can't pay, every time something breaks in your apartment, who do you call? The answer was no one. I hadn't asked them for a dime since Harold's funeral. But apparently, in Thalia's mind, my very existence was a burden. I see, I said softly. Don't take it personally, Thalia continued, warming to her theme. It's just that Darren and I are trying to build something here. We're young, we're ambitious, and we can't be constantly worried about supporting someone who won't even try to support herself. Won't even try. The words echoed in my mind as I looked at this woman who'd never worked a day in her life, who spent her husband's paycheck on designer handbags and spa treatments, who lived in a house she didn't know I owned while lecturing me about self-sufficiency. Thalia, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes? I looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, I let her see something real, something that made her lean back slightly in her chair. You have no idea what's coming for you. The silence that followed was deafening. Darren shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Thalia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Excuse me? She finally managed. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. Thank you for dinner. The lasagna was exactly what I expected. I walked to the front door, my footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Behind me, I could hear Thalia's sharp whisper. Did she just threaten me? At the door, I turned back. Both of them were staring at me from the dining room doorway. Darren looked confused. Thalia looked rattled. Oh, and Thalia, I said, my hand on the doorknob. About that job advice? What about it? I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. You might want to start updating your own resume. 3 days passed before Darren called. I'd been expecting it, of course. Thalia wouldn't have let him rest until he'd gotten some answers about my bizarre behavior at dinner. I was in my small apartment, sitting by the window with my morning coffee, when the phone rang. Mom? His voice was cautious, like he was speaking to someone who might be unstable. Can we talk? Of course, sweetheart. Would you like to come over? There was a pause. In 3 years, Darren had never once visited my apartment. He'd offered to help me move in, but I'd declined. He'd suggested stopping by for coffee, but there was always some excuse from Thalia about why that wouldn't work. Now, faced with the possibility of actually seeing how his mother lived, he sounded uncertain. Yes. Okay. I'll be there in an hour. I spent the next 60 minutes preparing for the most important conversation I'd had with my son in years. I made his favorite coffee, the expensive kind I kept hidden in the back of my cupboard. I put away the financial documents I'd been reviewing. I changed from my usual thrift store cardigan into something slightly nicer, though still carefully modest. When he arrived, Darren looked around the small apartment with barely concealed pity. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, furniture that looked like it had come from yard sales, which technically some of it had. The rest I'd bought specifically to create this impression. Mom, this place is... He struggled for words. Small? I suggested. I was going to say depressing. I poured him coffee in one of my good cups, another little luxury I kept hidden from view most of the time. He took a sip and looked surprised. This is really good coffee. I splurge occasionally. We sat across from each other at my small kitchen table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Darren cleared his throat. About Friday night. Yes? Thalia's really upset. She thinks you threatened her. I met his eyes steadily. What do you think? He shifted in his chair. I think something's going on with you that I don't understand. You've been different lately. Distant. And then Friday, the way you looked at Thalia, the things you said. The things I said were true. What does that mean, Mom? You told her she has no idea what's coming for her. That sounds like a threat. I took a sip of my coffee, considering my words carefully. The time for complete honesty hadn't arrived yet, but I could offer him a glimpse behind the curtain. Darren, do you remember what your father used to say about people who mistake kindness for weakness? He said they learn the difference eventually. Exactly. I set down my cup. For 3 years, I've been kind, patient. I've watched your wife treat me like a burden, an embarrassment, a problem to be solved. I've listened to her suggestions about how I should live my life, what I should do with my time, how I should dress, what I should eat. Darren looked uncomfortable. She's just trying to help. Is she? Or is she trying to make me disappear in the most socially acceptable way possible? Mom, that's not... Let me ask you something. I leaned forward. When was the last time Thalia asked me how I was doing? Not how I was managing financially, not whether I needed help with bills, but how I was actually doing as a person. He opened his mouth, then closed it. When was the last time she asked about my interests, my hobbies, my friends? When was the last time she treated me like a human being instead of an inconvenience? Darren stared into his coffee cup. She's not. She doesn't mean to be cold. Doesn't she? The silence stretched between us. Finally, Darren looked up. So what are you saying? That you're going to cut us out of your life? I'm saying that some people are about to learn that actions have consequences. That still sounds like a threat. I stood up and walked to the small bookshelf in my living room. Hidden behind a row of paperback novels was a manila folder. I pulled it out and returned to the table. Darren, I said, opening the folder. There's something I need to tell you about your mother. Inside the folder were bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, documents I'd kept hidden for 3 years, waiting for the right moment. His eyes widened as he began to process what he was seeing. Mom, what is this? This is who I really am. I watched his face as he flipped through page after page, account balances that showed figures he'd never imagined, investment portfolios worth millions, property deeds for houses, commercial buildings, parcels of land across 3 states. I don't understand, he whispered. Your father and I were very successful, Darren. More successful than we ever let on. When he died, I inherited everything. I'm worth approximately $5 million. He stared at me like I'd just told him I was an alien. But you live here, in this apartment. You shop at thrift stores. You don't even have a car. By choice. Why? I closed the folder and looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved, and watched slowly disappear under his wife's influence. Because I needed to know who would love me when they thought I had nothing. The words hit him like a physical blow. I watched the realization dawn in his eyes, watched him understand what the last 3 years had really been about. You've been testing us. I've been protecting myself. From what? From people like your wife. Darren's hands were shaking as he set down his coffee cup. Mom, this is insane. You let us think you were struggling. You let Thalia think. I let Thalia show me exactly who she is. I kept my voice calm, matter of fact. And she did, repeatedly, for 3 years. But I'm your son. Yes, you are. And I needed to know if you were still my son, or if you'd become something else entirely. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you invited me somewhere without Thalia insisting on it? When was the last time you stood up for me when she was being cruel? Each question was a knife, and I could see them finding their marks. I never thought. I didn't realize she was being that bad. Or you chose not to see it because it was easier. We sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Darren spoke, his voice barely audible. What happens now? I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. My son, who'd inherited his father's dark eyes and gentle nature, at least until he'd met Thalia. My son, who used to bring me wildflowers when he was 5 and told me I was the prettiest mommy in the world. My son, who'd grown into a man who let his wife humiliate his mother without consequence. Now, I said softly, we find out if it's too late for you to remember who you used to be. And Thalia? I smiled, and I knew it wasn't a kind expression. Thalia is about to discover that some people aren't as helpless as they appear. Mom, what are you planning? Justice, I said simply. Long overdue justice. Darren stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. This is crazy! You can't just, what, punish her for 3 years of marriage problems? 3 years of calculated cruelty, I corrected. 3 years of treating me like dirt while living off your income, which comes from a job you only have because of the connections your father and I built over 20 years. That stopped him cold. What? Did you think that marketing position just fell into your lap? Your father called in favors to get you that interview. We've been pulling strings behind the scenes your entire adult life. His face went pale. How much of my life has been a lie? None of it was a lie, sweetheart, but some of it was. Protected. I stood and walked to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. I love you, Darren. I've loved you since before you were born. But love doesn't mean accepting abuse, not even from family. He turned to face me, and for a moment, I saw the little boy he used to be. What do I do? That's up to you. But I want you to think about something. What? In 3 years of marriage, has Thalia ever once encouraged you to spend time with me? Has she ever suggested that maybe, just maybe, I might have value beyond what I could provide financially? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. That's what I thought. I squeezed his arm gently. Some storms are coming, sweetheart. When they hit, you'll have to decide which side of them you want to be on. Is that a threat? It's a promise, I said. And unlike some people in your life, I always keep my promises. I gave them a week to process what I'd told Darren. A week for him to go home, look at his wife with new eyes, and decide what kind of man he wanted to be. A week for Thalia to wonder what exactly I'd meant by my parting words at their dinner table. The call came on a Wednesday morning. Thalia's voice, sharp and demanding, cut through the peaceful quiet of my apartment. Eileen, we need to talk, right now. Good morning to you too, Thalia. Don't play games with me. Darren told me about your little revelation about the money. I smiled, settling into my favorite chair with my coffee. Did he? Yes, he did. And I want to know what kind of sick game you've been playing. What kind of game do you think I've been playing? Her voice rose an octave. You let us think you were poor. You sat there and let me worry about you. Let me try to help you. And all this time you were secretly rich. Let her worry about me. Let her try to help. The revisionist history was breathtaking, even for Thalia. I see. And how exactly did you help me, dear? We invited you to dinner. We included you in family events. You mean the dinners where you served me on mismatched plates and lectured me about getting a job at Walmart? Silence. Then, you're coming over. Tonight. We're settling this. Am I? Yes. 7 o'clock. And Eileen? You owe us an explanation. The line went dead. I set the phone down and finished my coffee, thinking about the conversation that lay ahead. Then I walked to my bedroom closet and pushed aside the thrift store cardigans and discount dresses. In the back, wrapped in protective garment bags, hung the clothes I used to wear, the clothes that reflected who I really was. I selected a black dress, elegant but not flashy, real jewelry, not costume pieces, shoes that cost more than Thalia spent on groceries in a month. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who could buy and sell everything Thalia had ever owned without checking her bank balance. It was time to stop hiding. I arrived at their house at exactly 7 o'clock, the same house I'd purchased for them 7 years ago, though they'd never known it. The same house whose mortgage I'd been quietly paying through a property management company, letting them believe Darren's salary covered it. Darren answered the door, and his eyes widened when he saw me. "Mom, you look different. Like yourself," he said quietly. "Like you used to look when Dad was alive." Thalia appeared behind him, and her expression was pure venom. She'd dressed for battle, too, in a designer outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. But next to the quiet confidence of real wealth, her attempts at intimidation looked like a child playing dress-up. "Well, well," she said, looking me up and down. "The poor widow has quite the wardrobe hidden away. Among other things," I replied mildly. We moved to the living room, the same room I'd helped them furnish when they'd first moved in. I took a seat on the sofa I'd helped them pick out, in the house I'd bought, surrounded by the life I'd made possible for them. "Okay," Thalia said, positioning herself like a prosecutor about to deliver closing arguments. "Let's hear it. The whole truth. What would you like to know? Everything. How much money do you have? Why did you lie to us? What kind of person pretends to be poor for 3 years? I folded my hands in my lap and looked at her calmly. The kind of person who wants to know who her real friends are. Friends? Thalia's laugh was sharp and brittle. I'm your daughter-in-law, not your friend. Family doesn't lie to family, doesn't it? Then perhaps you'd like to explain why you told the neighbors I was becoming senile and that you were worried about my mental health? Thalia's face went pale. Darren turned to stare at her. I never said that. You told Mrs. Henderson that I was showing signs of dementia. You suggested to the mailman that I might need to be placed in a care facility soon. You've been building a narrative about my declining mental state for months. That's not. Not what? Not true? Or not something you expected me to find out about? Darren's voice was barely a whisper. Thalia? Is that true? She spun toward him, eyes blazing. I was concerned. She was acting strange, saying weird things, dressing like a bag lady. I thought she might be losing it. Or, I said softly, you were laying groundwork for having me declared incompetent so you could access what you thought was Harold's life insurance money. The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Thalia's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. That's insane, she finally managed. Why would I do that? I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope. Because 3 months ago, you contacted an elder law attorney. You inquired about the process for obtaining guardianship over an elderly relative who was showing signs of mental decline. Darren shot to his feet. What? I opened the envelope and pulled out printed emails, phone records, consultation notes. You wanted to know how quickly the process could be completed and whether there were ways to expedite it if the relative had significant assets. How did you get those? Thalia's voice was barely audible. Money opens many doors, dear, including the ones you thought were locked. Darren was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. Thalia, please tell me this isn't true. It's not what it looks like, she said desperately. I was just worried about her. I wanted to know what options we had if she really was getting sick. Funny thing about that, I continued. The attorney's notes indicate you were particularly interested in whether guardianship would give you access to bank accounts and investment portfolios. You specifically asked about liquidating assets for the patient's own good. The color drained from Thalia's face completely. She sank into a chair, her hands shaking. Mom, Darren said, his voice hollow. Please tell me you're making this up. I'm afraid not, sweetheart. But why? Why would she do this? I looked at Thalia, who was staring at the floor, and felt something that might have been pity if she'd deserved it. Because she never loved you, Darren. She loved what she thought you could provide. And when it became clear that your salary alone wasn't enough to fund the lifestyle she wanted, she started looking for other sources of income. That's not true, Thalia whispered. Isn't it? Then explain the credit card debt you've been hiding from your husband, the shopping sprees you've been financing with cash advances, the jewelry you've been pawning and replacing with fakes. Darren's face went white. What? I pulled out another set of documents. Your wife has been living beyond your means for 2 years. She owes $43,000 on cards you don't know about. Thalia, is this true? She finally looked up and her face was streaked with tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage. You bitch, she hissed at me. You vindictive, manipulative bitch. You set me up. I didn't set you up, dear. I simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own choices. She stood up, swaying slightly. You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you've won? Won what? You wanted to destroy my marriage, and you did it. Congratulations. I stood as well, and suddenly the small apartment version of me was gone completely. In her place stood the woman who'd built a business empire alongside her husband, who'd made million-dollar decisions without blinking, who'd never backed down from a fight in her life. I didn't destroy your marriage, Thalia. You did. The moment you decided that my son was just a stepping stone to something better. I love Darren. You love what Darren represents. Security, status, a meal ticket. But you've never loved him. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Reveal what you really are? I walked closer to her, close enough that she had to look up to meet my eyes. You want to know what's really going to happen here, Thalia? What? You're going to pack your things and you're going to leave this house. Tonight. She laughed, high and wild. You can't make me leave my own home. Actually, I can. I pulled out one more document from my purse, the deed to the house, with my name clearly visible as the owner. This house belongs to me. It always has. Darren, and you have been living here as my guests for 7 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Darren stared at the deed like it was written in a foreign language. Mom, what does this mean? It means your wife has 30 minutes to pack a bag and get out of my house. Thalia was shaking now, fury and fear warring in her expression. You can't do this. I have rights. Tenant rights. You're not a tenant. You're a guest who's overstayed her welcome. I folded the deed and put it away. 30 minutes, Thalia. After that, I call the police and have you removed for trespassing. Darren! She turned to him desperately. Say something. This is our home. But Darren was still staring at the spot where the deed had been, processing the full scope of what he'd just learned. Darren! She screamed. He looked up at her, and his expression was that of a man seeing clearly for the first time in years. Get out, he said quietly. What? Get out of my mother's house. Thalia's face crumpled, but I felt no satisfaction in her tears. Only tired relief that the charade was finally over. This isn't over, she said, looking at me with pure hatred. You think you've won, but this isn't over. I smiled, and I made sure she could see exactly how little her threats meant to me. Oh, but it is, dear. This is just the beginning of what happens to people who mistake my kindness for weakness. She ran from the room, her footsteps pounding up the stairs. I could hear her throwing things around, slamming drawers, sobbing with rage. Darren and I stood in the living room, surrounded by the wreckage of his marriage and the echoes of 3 years of lies finally exposed to the light. Mom, he said finally. Yes? I'm sorry. I know you are, sweetheart. What happens now? I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street, thinking about second chances and the price of forgiveness. Now we find out if it's possible to rebuild what we lost. The calls started the next morning. First my sister-in-law, Margaret, Harold's brother's wife, her voice tight with disapproval. Eileen, what in God's name has gotten into you? Thalia called me crying last night. She says you threw her out of her own home. I was sitting in my small apartment, still maintaining the charade for now, sipping coffee from my chipped mug while listening to Margaret's outrage. Did she mention why? I asked mildly. She said you've been lying about money, pretending to be poor when you're actually wealthy. Eileen, that's disturbed behavior. Is it? Yes. And now you've kicked a young woman out of her home because of some family squabble. Harold would be ashamed. Harold would be ashamed. The word stung because once upon a time, Margaret's opinion had mattered to me. She'd been like a sister during the early years of my marriage, before Thalia had poisoned that well too. Margaret, did Thalia happen to mention the attorney she consulted about having me declared incompetent? Silence. Or the $43,000 in secret debt she's accumulated? What are you talking about? Ask her. When you're done feeling sorry for her, ask her about the real reason she wanted access to my finances. I hung up before she could respond. The phone rang again immediately. Harold's sister, Patricia, with the same outrage, the same accusations, the same willful blindness to what Thalia really was. By noon, I'd received calls from 6 relatives, all parroting the same narrative. Poor Thalia, innocent victim of a vindictive mother-in-law who'd lost her mind with grief. I listened to each one, made mental notes about who had called, and said very little in my own defense. Let them show themselves. Let them reveal how quickly they'd turn on family when presented with a sob story from a manipulative stranger. The most disturbing call came from my nephew David, Margaret's son, whom I'd helped put through college just 5 years earlier. Aunt Eileen, he said, his voice careful and professional. I've been talking to some people about your situation. My situation? Your behavior lately. The family is concerned that you might be showing signs of dementia or some other cognitive decline. I set down my coffee cup very carefully. Who exactly has been discussing my cognitive state? Well, Thalia mentioned some incidents, strange behavior, paranoid thinking, accusations against family members. And now this business with throwing her out. David, let me ask you something. Do you remember who paid for your final year at Northwestern? What does that have to do with anything? Humor me. Mom and Dad helped, and I had loans. Your parents contributed $8,000. I paid the remaining $32,000. Silence. I also paid for your sister's wedding, your mother's breast cancer treatment that insurance didn't cover, and the down payment on your first house, all of which you know perfectly well. Aunt Eileen, so when you talk about my cognitive decline, you might want to consider whether someone with dementia would remember those details quite so clearly. He hung up without another word. The pattern was becoming clear. Thalia hadn't just disappeared quietly into the night. She'd launched a campaign, painting herself as the victim of an unstable older woman who'd suddenly snapped. And like poison in a well, her version of events was spreading through the family network. 2 days later, Darren called. His voice was strained, exhausted. Mom, can we meet? We need to talk. Of course. Where? Not at the house. Thalia's been. She's been calling everyone. The family's in an uproar. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of anonymous place where 2 people could have a difficult conversation without being overheard. Darren looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red-rimmed, his clothes wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled. She's destroyed me, he said without preamble. What do you mean? Thalia, she's not just telling everyone her version of what happened. She's making things up. I wasn't surprised, but I waited for him to continue. She told my boss that you're suffering from dementia and that I've been distracted at work, worried about your mental health. She suggested they might want to consider whether my job performance has been affected. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Not content with destroying her own reputation, she was now trying to sabotage Darren's career. What did your boss say? He was sympathetic. Suggested I might want to look into FMLA, maybe take some time off to deal with family medical issues. And you told him? What could I tell him? That my wife is a liar who tried to have my mother declared incompetent so she could steal her money? That I've been living in a house my mother owns without knowing it? That my entire adult life has been built on foundations I never understood? His voice was rising, drawing glances from other customers. I reached across the table and touched his hand. Lower your voice, sweetheart. He laughed bitterly. She's been one step ahead of me this whole time. By the time I realized what she was doing, she'd already poisoned half the family against you and made me look like either a liar or an idiot at work. What else? She's living with her sister now, crying to anyone who'll listen about how you manipulated our marriage, how you set traps for her, how you're dangerous and unstable. I sipped my coffee, thinking. Thalia was more resourceful than I'd given her credit for. She'd turned her humiliation into a weapon, her exposure into martyrdom. There's more, Darren continued. She's been to see a lawyer. About what? About the house. She's claiming she has tenant rights, that you can't just evict her without proper notice. She's also claiming you coerced her into leaving under duress. And what did the lawyer tell her? That she doesn't have a case. But here's the thing, Mom. She's not trying to win. She's trying to make our lives hell. I nodded. It was exactly what I'd expected from someone like Thalia once she realized she'd lost everything. Show me, I said. What? Show me what she's been telling people. I want to see exactly what we're dealing with. Darren pulled out his phone and opened his social media. The posts were masterfully crafted, each one designed to elicit maximum sympathy while maintaining plausible deniability. Going through a difficult time with family. Sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who hurt you deepest. Prayers appreciated. Learning hard truths about manipulation and psychological abuse. Grateful for friends who see through the lies. When someone spends years pretending to be something they're not, what else are they lying about? Trust your instincts. Each post had dozens of comments expressing support, outrage on her behalf, condemnation of unnamed family members who'd obviously wronged this poor young woman. She's good, I admitted. She's evil. No, she's desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. What kind of mistakes? I handed him back his phone and leaned forward. The kind that reveal more than they intended. I don't understand. Look at the pattern, Darren. What's the one thing missing from all her posts? He scrolled through them again, frowning. I don't see it. She never once mentions loving you. Not once. She talks about being betrayed, being manipulated, being lied to, but she never says she's heartbroken about losing her marriage. She never says she misses her husband. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Because she doesn't. Not because she never did. This isn't grief, sweetheart. This is rage at being caught. We sat in silence for a moment, processing the depth of Thalia's deception and the scope of the damage she was trying to inflict. What do we do? Darren asked finally. I smiled, and I made sure he could see that whatever sympathy I might have felt for his wife had evaporated completely. We let her keep digging. What? Right now, Thalia thinks she's winning. She thinks she's successfully painted herself as the victim and us as the villains. She's feeling confident, maybe even triumphant. And that helps us how? Because confident people get careless. They overreach. They make the kind of mistakes that reveal who they really are. You think she'll slip up? I don't think it, sweetheart. I know it, because I've been watching her for 3 years, and I know exactly what kind of person she is. I reached into my purse and pulled out another manila envelope, this one thicker than the others. What's that? Insurance. What kind of insurance? The kind that proves everything I've been telling you about your wife's true nature. Darren's eyes widened. What do you mean? I mean that while Thalia was busy planning my downfall, I was busy documenting hers. Every financial indiscretion, every lie she told, every manipulation she attempted. It's all here. Why haven't you used it? Because I wanted to give her enough rope to hang herself. And judging by her behavior over the last few days, I'd say she's about to tie the noose. Mom, what are you planning? I stood up, gathering my things with the careful precision of someone who'd been planning this moment for a very long time. Justice, sweetheart. Pure, simple justice. And what does that look like? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and watched nearly lose himself to a woman who'd never deserved him. It looks like the truth. All of it. Every ugly, manipulative, calculating piece of it. When? Soon, I said. Very soon. Because if there's one thing I've learned about people like Thalia, it's that they can't resist trying to land one final blow. And when she does, we'll be ready. I didn't have to wait long for Thalia to make her fatal mistake. It came exactly 1 week after our conversation at the cafe, in the form of a phone call that would expose everything she really was. The call came to my apartment at 2:30 in the afternoon. I was reviewing some investment portfolios when the phone rang, the caller ID showing a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Holloway, this is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Sacramento Police Department. My blood went cold. Yes? Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about a report that's been filed against you. Allegations of elder abuse and financial exploitation. I set down my papers very carefully. I'm sorry, what? A young woman named Thalia Holloway has filed a complaint alleging that you've been the victim of financial abuse by family members, and that those same family members are now retaliating against her for trying to help you. The audacity was breathtaking. Even for Thalia, this crossed a line I hadn't expected her to cross. Detective Martinez, I think there's been some confusion. Ma'am, could you come down to the station? We'd like to get your side of the story. Of course. I'll be there within the hour. I hung up and immediately called my attorney, Jonathan Reeves, a man who'd been handling my legal affairs since Harold's death. Jonathan, I need you to meet me at the Sacramento Police Department immediately. What's happened? My former daughter-in-law has accused my son and me of elder abuse and financial exploitation. There was a pause. That's a serious charge, Eileen. Yes, it is, and completely fabricated. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I changed into one of my better outfits, gathered every document I thought I might need, and drove to the police station in the BMW I kept garaged across town. It was time to stop hiding who I really was. Detective Martinez was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She looked surprised when I walked into the interview room with Jonathan, both of us dressed like the successful professionals we were. Mrs. Holloway, I have to say, you're not quite what I expected based on the report we received. What exactly did the report say? She consulted her notes. According to Ms. Thalia Holloway, you're a vulnerable elderly woman who's been systematically financially abused by your son and his wife. She claims they've been stealing from you, controlling your access to money, and forcing you to live in substandard conditions. I looked at Jonathan, who nodded slightly. She also claims that when she tried to intervene on your behalf, your son became violent and threatening, and that you've been turned against her through manipulation and possibly psychological abuse. I see. And what evidence did she provide to support these claims? She provided photos of your apartment, which she says demonstrate the poor conditions you're forced to live in. She also provided what she claims are financial documents showing discrepancies in your accounts. Detective Martinez pulled out a folder and showed me printed photographs of my small apartment. Pictures taken through windows, showing the modest furniture, the small kitchen, the carefully maintained appearance of poverty I'd been cultivating. She also provided these, the detective continued, pulling out photocopied bank statements that showed my checking account, the one I used for daily expenses. The balance was consistently low, rarely more than a few $100s. Detective, I said calmly, may I ask when these photos were taken? She says within the last month. And she obtained them how? She says she was concerned about your welfare and wanted to document your living conditions. So she was stalking me. Detective Martinez looked uncomfortable. She characterized it as conducting welfare checks. Jonathan leaned forward. Detective, has anyone bothered to verify any of Ms. Thalia Holloway's claims? We're in the process of investigating. Good, I said, reaching into my purse, because I have some documents that might interest you. I placed my real bank statements on the table, the ones showing my actual financial position. Detective Martinez's eyes widened as she processed the numbers. Mrs. Holloway, these show assets of approximately $5 million, yes. But the statements Ms. Thalia provided show one account, my household expense account. I maintain multiple accounts for different purposes. Jonathan pulled out additional documents. Detective, my client is a wealthy widow who chose to live modestly for personal reasons. She's never been financially abused, and she's certainly never been controlled by her son. Then why would Ms. Thalia make these accusations? I smiled grimly. Because she's the one who attempted financial exploitation, and when she was caught, she decided to try one last desperate gambit. I pulled out the envelope I'd shown Darren at the cafe, the one containing evidence of Thalia's real activities. These documents show that Ms. Thalia Holloway contacted an elder law attorney about obtaining guardianship over me. She specifically inquired about gaining access to what she believed were substantial assets. Detective Martinez studied the documents, her expression growing more serious. She also accumulated over $40,000 in secret debt during her marriage, debt she was hiding from her husband while pressuring him to extract money from me. How did you obtain these documents? Legal investigation services. When someone is attempting to have you declared incompetent, you tend to want to know everything about their motivations and methods. I pulled out more papers. These show her online searches for information about elder abuse, conservatorship laws, and how to prove someone is mentally incompetent. All conducted in the weeks before she began spreading rumors about my mental health. The detective was quiet for a long moment, reviewing everything I'd provided. Mrs. Holloway, if what you're telling me is true, then Ms. Thalia has filed a false police report. Yes, she has. That's a serious crime. Yes, it is. Detective Martinez looked at Jonathan. What does your client want to do about this? We want Ms. Thalia prosecuted to the full extent of the law, he said without hesitation. And, I added, we want a restraining order preventing her from contacting me, my son, or any member of our family. The detective nodded slowly. I'll need to discuss this with the district attorney's office, but based on what you've shown me, it appears Ms. Thalia Holloway has committed several crimes. What happens now? I asked. Now we arrest her. 2 hours later, I was sitting in my real apartment, the luxury penthouse I'd called home for the past 3 years, when Darren called. Mom, the police just called me. They arrested Thalia. I know. You know? How do you? Mom, where are you? I went by your apartment, and it's empty. I looked around my real home, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the one filled with the antiques and artwork Harold and I had collected over 20 years of marriage. I'm at home, sweetheart. What do you mean? I mean, I'm at my real home. The apartment was just another costume. Silence. Then, Mom, I don't understand anything anymore. Come to the Meridian Towers on 5th Street, penthouse level. I'll explain everything. 30 minutes later, Darren stood in my real living room, staring at surroundings that probably cost more than most people made in a year. This is where you've been living? This is where I've always lived. Even when I was visiting you in that little apartment, I came home to this. He sank into one of my leather chairs, his head in his hands. She really tried to have you declared incompetent. Yes? And she filed a false police report. Yes? Why? Why go that far? I poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle that cost more than Thalia spent on shoes in a month. Because she's not just greedy, Darren. She's genuinely malicious. When she realized she couldn't get what she wanted through manipulation, she decided to destroy us both out of spite. What happens to her now? She'll be prosecuted for filing a false report, attempted fraud, and possibly stalking. She'll likely serve some jail time, and she'll definitely have a criminal record. He was quiet for a long time, processing everything. I feel like I don't know anything about my own life, he said finally. You know the important things. You know I love you. You know you're a good man who got caught up with a bad woman. You know you have a second chance to build something real. Do I? Do we? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and protected, and almost lost to someone who'd never deserved him. That depends. On what? On whether you can forgive yourself for not seeing who she really was, and whether you can forgive me for the test I put you through. You were protecting yourself. I was, but I was also testing you. And that's not fair. A mother shouldn't have to test her child's love. Darren looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw the boy he used to be before Thalia had gotten her claws into him. Can we start over? I'd like that very much. No more tests, no more games, no more lies, no more tests, I agreed. But, sweetheart? Yeah? If you ever bring home another woman like Thalia, I'm moving to Europe and not leaving a forwarding address. For the first time in months, my son laughed. Really laughed. Deal, he said. Definitely deal. 6 months later, I was sitting on my terrace watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and amber when Darren called with news I'd been expecting. The divorce is final, he said, his voice lighter than it had been in years. How do you feel? Free. Terrified, but free. I smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. Freedom after prolonged captivity was always a mixture of relief and uncertainty. And Thalia, sentenced to 6 months in county jail, 3 years probation, and she has to pay restitution for the legal costs her false report generated. Good. She also has a restraining order that prevents her from contacting either of us for 2 years. Even better. There was a pause. Then Darren asked the question I'd been waiting for. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. When did you know? When did you know she was going to try something like this? I sipped my wine, thinking back to the moment I'd first realized what Thalia truly was. The second week after your father's funeral, she came to visit me, supposedly to check on how I was doing. I remember that. She spent 5 minutes asking about my grief and 45 minutes asking about Harold's life insurance, his investments, what kind of inheritance I'd be leaving you someday. She was grieving too. Dad had been like a father to her. No, sweetheart. She was calculating. There's a difference. I could hear him processing this, probably remembering that visit with new understanding. That's when I decided to test her, to see if my suspicions were correct. And they were. Unfortunately, yes. But Darren, I want you to understand something. I didn't do all this just to prove Thalia was terrible. I did it to save you. Save me from what? From a life with someone who would have destroyed you piece by piece. She wouldn't have stopped with trying to control your mother. Eventually, she would have controlled every aspect of your life. The silence stretched between us, comfortable now in a way it hadn't been for years. I have something to tell you too, he said finally. What's that? I've been seeing someone, my heart clenched, half with hope and half with protective fear. Tell me about her. Her name is Rebecca. She's a teacher at the elementary school near my office. We met at a coffee shop 3 months ago. And she doesn't know anything about our money. She thinks I'm just a regular guy with a regular job who lives in a house I inherited from my grandmother. I laughed despite myself. You told her you inherited my house? Well, technically that's true, isn't it? I mean, someday? Someday? Yes. What's she like? She's normal, kind. She volunteers at an animal shelter on weekends. She drives a 10-year-old Honda and thinks Olive Garden is fancy dining. Do you love her? Another pause, longer this time. I think I could. But Mom, I'm scared. Of what? Of not being able to tell the difference between real love and manipulation. Of making the same mistake again. I stood up and walked to the edge of my terrace, looking out over the city where my son was learning to rebuild his life. Sweetheart, can I tell you something your father used to say? What? He used to say that the difference between love and manipulation is that love makes you feel like the best version of yourself, while manipulation makes you feel like you're never good enough. I like that. How does Rebecca make you feel? Like I used to feel, before. Like I'm enough just as I am. Then trust that feeling, and trust yourself. You're not the same man who fell for Thalia's games. You're wiser now. I hope so. I know so. But Darren. Yeah? When you're ready, I'd like to meet her. Really? Really. And this time, I promise to be myself from the beginning. No tests, no costumes, no games. She might be intimidated by all this. I could hear him gesturing at what I assumed was his memory of my penthouse. Then we'll meet somewhere neutral, somewhere that puts her at ease. You'd do that? Sweetheart, I've spent 3 years pretending to be someone I'm not. I'm tired of pretending. If Rebecca is someone who might become important to you, then she's someone I want to know. What if she doesn't like you? Then she's not the right woman for you. And what if you don't like her? I smiled, remembering my promise about moving to Europe. Then I'll keep my opinions to myself unless you ask for them. Mom? Yes? Thank you. For what? For saving me, even when I didn't know I needed saving. After we hung up, I stayed on the terrace as the sky darkened and the city lights began to twinkle below. I thought about the past 3 years, about the elaborate deception I'd maintained, about the pain of watching my son slowly disappear under his wife's influence. I thought about Harold, who would have handled this situation completely differently. He would have confronted Thalia directly, probably within the first month of noticing her behavior. But then again, Harold had never had to wonder whether people loved him for himself or for his money. That particular burden had fallen to me after his death. My phone buzzed with a text message. Margaret, Harold's sister-in-law, the first person to call and condemn me when Thalia had launched her campaign of lies. Eileen, I owe you an apology. I had lunch with Patricia today, and we pieced together the timeline of what really happened. I'm ashamed that I believed Thalia's lies without even asking for your side of the story. Can we talk? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Margaret, apology accepted. But I think we both learned something important about making judgments without all the facts. Her response came quickly. We did. And Eileen? I'm proud of you for protecting yourself and Darren. That took incredible strength. More messages followed over the next hour. Patricia, David, even some cousins I'd barely spoken to in years. All of them apologizing, all of them admitting they'd been too quick to believe Thalia's version of events. I answered each one with grace, but I made mental notes about who had jumped to condemn me and how quickly they'd done it. Some relationships could be repaired, but they would never be quite the same. The last message of the evening came from an unexpected source. Detective Martinez. Mrs. Holloway, thought you'd want to know that Ms. Thalia attempted to contact you through the jail's phone system today. The call was blocked due to the restraining order, but I wanted you to be aware. I wasn't surprised. Thalia would never truly accept defeat. Even from jail, she was probably planning her next move, her next attempt to cause trouble. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't worried about what she might do. I'd stopped hiding. I'd stopped pretending to be vulnerable. I'd reclaimed my power, my voice, and my life. I poured myself another glass of wine and settled back into my chair. Tomorrow, I would start the process of selling the house where Darren and Thalia had lived. I'd already decided to give the proceeds to him, a real inheritance, rather than the fake vulnerability I'd used as a test. Tomorrow, I would also start planning for the future. Real plans, not elaborate deceptions. Maybe travel, maybe philanthropy, maybe just the simple pleasure of living authentically without constantly watching over my shoulder. But tonight, I was content to sit on my terrace, surrounded by the luxury I'd earned and the peace I'd fought for, knowing that my son was free to build a life with someone who might actually love him. The phone rang one more time. Darren again. Mom, I forgot to ask. What are you going to do now? With your life, I mean. I looked out over the city, thinking about all the possibilities that lay ahead. I'm going to live it, I said, openly, honestly, without apology. I'm going to be exactly who I am. And who is that? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. A woman who survived a test of her own making and came out stronger on the other side. A mother who fought for her son even when he couldn't fight for himself. A widow who honored her husband's memory by protecting what they built together. I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know. After I hung up, I stayed on the terrace until the wine was gone and the city had settled into its quiet, nighttime rhythm. For 3 years, I'd lived in the shadows, testing the people I loved, protecting myself from those who would use me. Now, finally, I was ready to step back into the light. Not as the grieving widow who needed protection, not as the vulnerable elderly woman who could be taken advantage of, but as Eileen Holloway, successful businesswoman, devoted mother, and survivor of one of the most elaborate long-term deceptions I'd ever conceived. It had cost me 3 years of authentic living, several relationships I'd once valued, and more emotional energy than I cared to calculate. But it had saved my son, exposed a dangerous predator, and taught me that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. As I finally headed inside to bed, I caught my reflection in the glass doors. Not the tired, shabby woman I'd pretended to be, but the real me. Well-dressed, confident, unashamed of my success or my choices. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new relationships to navigate, new decisions to make. But whatever came next, I would face it as myself. And that, after 3 years of elaborate pretense, felt like the greatest victory of all. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.